Now, this is the first time that I feel I have something very much in common with the Magi. The star led the Magi to Bethlehem, and the star has led me to Bethlehem too from this point onward. Let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the Magi secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen at its rising went before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were in their second year or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the Magi. And then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Now, I think it's fair to say that aside from the sun and the moon, and perhaps Venus and Jupiter, the Star of Bethlehem is the best known celestial body. It is a prominent feature of our Christmas celebrations, on our trees, in our nativity plays, and on our Christmas cards. But what was the Star of Bethlehem? And what did it do to mark Jesus' birth? The mystery of the Star of Bethlehem has tantalized the world, particularly over the last few centuries, as our knowledge of astronomy has grown. And the quest to identify the star has been described by one astronomer as the greatest of all detective stories, and perhaps the greatest of all astronomical mysteries. Particularly in our 21st century, the implications of identifying the star are significant. The reliability of the Gospels. No part of the Gospels, it seems to me, is held up to more ridicule and contempt than Matthew's account of the Star of Bethlehem. Some have even claimed that no scientific explanation of the star is possible. For example, Bart Ehrman has written, "How is it that a star or any celestial body can lead anyone to a particular town? And how can it then stop over a particular house?" If Matthew's account, however, can be shown to be historically credible or even verifiably true, that would be powerful evidence for the reliability of Matthew's gospel. Of course, the biggest thing at stake in any discussion of the star is, was Jesus who he claimed to be? It is very difficult to deny Jesus' messianic status if what Matthew says about the star can be authenticated. And if Matthew's star did what he reports that it did, it would remind a world in which science is regarded as the touchstone of all reliable knowledge, that God is the creator and the sustainer of the universe, the owner of the world, the source of all mathematical knowledge and physics, who calls all humans everywhere to follow him. Now, we need to start by briefly considering our primary source, Matthew's Gospel, an ancient biography with a genuine interest in telling history. Matthew's Gospel was most likely written around 70 AD, based directly and indirectly on eyewitness testimony. We can trust Matthew's account of the star in particular because it's in perfect accord with what we know of the period. For one thing, toward the end of his life, a paranoid Herod was increasingly ruthless and capable of the most heinous crimes, even against his own family. And he even arranged to have the top noblemen executed at his death to ensure weeping at his funeral. He didn't actually carry out the order, but that was his instruction. Moreover, no early Christian, especially not a devout Jewish one, would, in a bid to strengthen Jesus' messianic claims, invent an endorsement by, of all people, astrologers, pagan astrologers. Also, the star is mentioned in a number of independent sources. The early church father Ignatius, writing a few decades after Matthew, but probably citing a first century hymn, describes the star. He writes, "A star shone in heaven with a brightness beyond all the stars. Its light was indescribable, and its newness caused astonishment. And all the rest of the stars, together with the sun and the moon, formed a chorus to the star, yet its light far exceeded them all. And there was perplexity regarding from where this new entity came, so unlike anything else in the heavens was it." It's also mentioned in the apocryphal Gospel of James from the first half of the 2nd century, where it's described as big and bright, and in some other sources too. Now, the question that we have to consider up front is, when was Jesus' birth approximately? Well, we know that Herod the Great died in the spring of 4 BC, because all three sons of Herod date the start of their reigns from then. And Josephus tells us that Archelaus' 10-year reign ended in 6 AD, and if you do the maths, you can see, indeed, his reign started in 4 BC. So Jesus was clearly born in advance of that in the preceding couple of years, most believe either in the year 6 or 5 BC. In case you're wondering why Jesus was born in 6 or 5 BC rather than 0, you should know that the 6th century monk whose calculations were the basis of the BC AD dates, neglected to allow for a year 0 and left out 4 years of Octavian's reign when he reigned under the name Octavian rather than Caesar Augustus. What a bummer to do all of that and miss out some information like that. Oh well, we can cope. As a result, it leads to these strange things of Jesus being born BC. Anyway, the story of the star. I want to just quickly work through Matthew's Gospel to look in particular at what the star did. And the first thing I want you to notice of what the star did is that it appeared. Matthew tells us that when Herod met with the magi, he was strangely eager to know when the star had first appeared. Now that is actually weird, because the magi were focused on the star's rising. Note what the magi asked in Matthew chapter 2. "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we have seen a star at its rising and have come to worship him." So the rising had been the catalyst for this urgent pilgrimage of the Magi to Judea, and it evidently occurred just a couple of months before their arrival in Jerusalem. The Magi obviously regarded the rising as significant and coinciding with the Messiah's birth. But Herod wanted to allow the possibility that the Messiah's birth may have taken place before that, at the time of the star's first appearance, or indeed any time after that. And we are informed that the Magi were able to give Herod the precise date when the star first appeared. Now, clearly they told Herod the star had first appeared over a year beforehand, because based on what they told him, Herod gave the order to execute the male infants, not only in their first year, but also in their second. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the star had been completely absent from the sky, and then at one particular point, on one particular day, it was first spotted by the Magi. The Magi made a record of that observation, which was the star's first appearance. And no doubt the Magi, as the star's discoverers and as good astronomers, were fascinated by this new entity charting its course across the sky on a nightly basis over the following months. The second major event that I want you to take note of is the rising that we've already mentioned. Again, the Magi say, "We have seen his star at its rising and have come to worship him." This word rising refers to an astronomical phenomenon, when a star, a planet, or a comet, after being invisible because it's too close to the sun, because the sun bleaches out the surrounding sky, re-emerges just over the eastern horizon just before dawn. And that rising was regarded as the most important moment in any celestial body's career. Whatever breathtaking and extraordinary thing this star did in connection with this rising stunned the Magi and communicated to them powerfully a lot of important information, prompting them to turn to the Hebrew Scriptures, prophecies about the Messiah, for answers, no doubt aided by Jewish neighbors. And what's astonishing is the Magi came to a firm conclusion. This star was disclosing that something momentous was happening on earth. The Jewish Messiah had been born. And the star's announcement of the Messiah's birth was evidently so compelling that the Magi became 100% certain that hundreds of miles away in Judea, the Jewish Messiah was right then a newborn baby. Indeed, they decided to undertake a brutally long and exacting journey to find and worship him. And they bought expensive special gifts to present to the newborn Messiah: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, revealing just how highly they esteemed him. The next thing I want you to observe about the star is that after the Magi had been in Jerusalem and met with Herod and discovered that the birthplace of the Messiah was Bethlehem, as they set out on that short 5 or 6 mile journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, going southwards obviously, the star was in the southern sky, going in front of them to Bethlehem. That the star that had launched them on this extraordinary mission was present to accompany them as they embarked on the last phase of that journey must have been a tremendous encouragement and reinforced their sense of holy awe as they were getting closer and closer to the baby Messiah. Nevertheless, when they got to Bethlehem, the Magi faced a daunting challenge, the challenge of locating the baby Messiah. But Matthew tells us that the star climaxed its display that night by, from the Magi's perspective, standing over one particular house, pinpointing it as the location where the baby Messiah was, with a precision akin to that of a GPS. And the Magi knew that the baby Messiah was in that house before they even entered. And when they went in, they fell down in worship before the baby king and presented to him their gifts. So putting it all together, we can say that the star was initially absent from the sky, then it first appears, then the bulk of a year later, it has a rising that communicates a lot of information. A couple of months after that, the length of a journey from the east to Judea, it's in the southern sky, seeming to go before them to Bethlehem. And later that night, it pinpoints the very house where the Messiah was. What a story that is. A powerful, momentous story, unprecedented in the annals of history. Now, we can ask a few introductory questions at this point. Who were the Magi? Well, the Magi were evidently, from word studies and from this text and the context, Gentile scholars engaged in various activities, in particular, of course, astronomy, astrology, and divination. From Matthew's account, we can see that they kept records of their observations because they're able to tell Herod the precise date when the star had first appeared. As to where the Magi came from, there have been various suggestions: Arabia, Persia, Babylon. Some have suggested Arabia simply because of the frankincense and myrrh coming naturally from Arabia. Others point to Isaiah chapter 60, where there's a prophecy of Arabians bringing gold and frankincense to pay homage to the Messiah. Problem is, Arabia is more to the south, especially the sources of frankincense and myrrh, and Isaiah 60 isn't referring to the Messiah's birth. As for Persia, or Parthia as it was then, we know very little about the state of astronomy at the time there. It remains a possible location, but far from certain. The most likely homeland of the Magi, it seems to me, is Babylon, which is due east of Jerusalem, has a sizable Jewish population, which would explain the Magi's familiarity with Old Testament oracles. Not only did the city have a long history of astronomy and astrology, but it remained the center of astronomical knowledge right up to the second half of the 1st century AD. Now, since the Magi are described as coming from the east and were obviously traveling with a sense of urgency, it seems much more likely that they would have taken a direct route across the stony, barren wilderness to Judea. That meant a long trip, almost certainly by camel caravan, would have probably taken around a month. The desert was extremely dangerous. Actually, it remained dangerous up until really the beginning of the 20th century. Many bandits roaming around looking for well-provisioned travelers to rob. Okay, that's a quick look at Matthew. Let's turn now to look at some of the theories concerning the Star of Bethlehem. Now, before we turn to the ones that you might hear in a planetarium, the astronomical ones, of course, in Christian circles, oftentimes you hear non-natural views. So let's first consider those, what we call the miraculous view. This view, in essence, maintains that the star was not a natural astronomical phenomenon. It was rather a non-natural, miraculous phenomenon visible only to the Magi. At least that's the most common view. The view, in my opinion, and I speak as someone that used to hold the view, is popular partly because it sounds pious, if I can say that, and partly because it looks like it's immune from criticism. Because you could kind of hide behind it, and when someone comes at you, you say, well, I didn't claim it was a scientific, observable thing. So it's easy to kind of jump a little bit. I actually think that there are many problems with the view, which I had to come to terms with myself. Because everything in Matthew indicates that the star was an astronomical object. It's called a star, aster. It has a rising, again, that is an astronomical term. It was observed by professional astronomers who were keeping records. And the same is true for Ignatius's account, where the star is portrayed as publicly visible as it interacts with the stars and the sun and the moon. And moreover, I find it very hard to believe that Herod and the people of Jerusalem would have reacted so strongly to the arrival of the Magi if they hadn't seen the star for themselves, but just not realized its significance. As for the view that the star was a ball of light stationed over the house, immediately over the house in Bethlehem, the simple truth is there's just no conceivable way that anybody could have recognized such a body, number one, even as it called it a star, but number two, to have identified it with the very same object that they had seen rising on the horizon a couple of months beforehand. And of course, why would a non-natural, miraculous star have been visible for over a year, particularly if only appearing to one group of men? Because the long appearance serves no positive purpose in the story. It only has an incidental and indirect significance. And finally, especially if this is the fulfillment of Balaam's oracle concerning a scepter star in Numbers chapter 24:17, are we really to believe that the Jews themselves didn't see the Messiah's star? That seems to me a very odd idea. Anyway, I do think that there is also another problem, is that the miraculous view, even though it sounds good and compelling when you first come across it, it doesn't really explain anything because it doesn't explain how were the Magi convinced that the Messiah had been born. Now, there is another version of the miraculous view, which is the angelic view. And this idea isn't so common, but it does occur from time to time. The idea that the star was an angel. I think it's actually a very implausible view, not just for the reasons I've just outlined, but also because Matthew is not reluctant in the Nativity to specify when angels are involved. It's also hard to imagine why an angel is playing the role of a star for over a year, and why an angel's activity is being described using astronomical terms like rising. So I think we can safely lay that view aside. Now, I actually think, and it may seem a strange thing to say, that the supernatural views, the so-called supernatural views, actually, in my honest opinion, leave the story enshrouded in a fog, and in some ways sap the wonder out of what God did to attest to Jesus. Personally, I'm convinced that if we take the biblical text seriously, as everyone here, I believe, does, that we should treat the star as a publicly visible astronomical phenomenon and not be afraid that Matthew's account might fail to withstand historical scrutiny. It will. We can trust that it will be seen to be historical. Leaving aside the miraculous views, we turn to a popular view in evangelical circles. I'm sure many of you have seen Larson's Jupiter theory. U.S. attorney Rick Larson, in his DVD, claims that the planet Jupiter played the part of the Star of Bethlehem. The magi, he maintains, were enthralled by the planet's regular movements in the sky in 3-2 BC. And he maintains that the three comings together of Jupiter and Venus, Jupiter and Regulus, I should say, framed by two conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter, that they were effectively, they explain the story of the Star of Bethlehem. And because of these events, the Magi travel to Judea and they arrive in Bethlehem, according to him, on December the 25th in 2 BC. And they know to stop in Bethlehem because Jupiter is going through a point where it appears to stop in the sky, and then just before it goes the other direction. Now, unfortunately, the Larson view is deeply flawed on many levels. Jupiter as a planet is a regular and predictable feature of the sky in the first century. It doesn't ever suddenly appear, as the Star of Bethlehem did. It would not have taken the Magi by surprise. And although the highlight of the star's time in the sky was its rising, Jupiter did not actually have a rising in 3-2 BC. The Magi could not have told when precisely to the hour Jupiter stopped, which, by the way, wasn't December 25th, it was a couple of days later, and certainly would never have based an itinerary on it. That would have been really nutty. Larson's chronology, moreover, is completely implausible. He has an absurdly long journey time, a month-long stay of the Magi in Jerusalem, and he has the Magi arriving in 2 BC, which is far too late. So, I can say that Larson DVD was actually what was the launching pad of my own investigation into the star, because I was frustrated with it and the fact that it didn't line up in any serious way with Matthew's gospel. What about the other common view, the one that's oftentimes preferred in planetariums, and that is that there were 3 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in 7 BC. Here, really 3 alignments of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces. It maintains that Jupiter was the planet of the ruler of the world, Saturn was the planet of the Jews, and Pisces, the constellation of the fish, was a constellation closely associated with the Jews. Unfortunately, as I found out after some painful research in medieval Jewish astrology, I would not recommend it as an edifying topic, but nonetheless, I didn't actually make its way into my book, which was extra painful. But anyway, there is no evidence whatsoever that Pisces, the fish, was regarded by anyone in the 1st century BC, AD, or 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, I could keep on going, in or outside Judea as being regarded as associated with the Jews. And if you actually look, because with the beauty of some of this astronomy is you just get planetarium software and you can see what's in the sky, the regular features of the sky. So you can see that actually Jupiter and Saturn never came close enough together to even look vaguely like one entity. They were always at least a moon apart from each other. And finally, any magi arriving in Bethlehem in 7 BC would have got there before Mary and Joseph, which really doesn't really fit the story, right? Okay, the star, or a supernova. What then was the star? Could it have been an ordinary star, or could it have been a supernova, which is a super bright exploding star? An ordinary star could not have suddenly appeared, could not have communicated so much information at its rising, because everybody knows when it's going to rise, what it's going to look like, everything about it. It could not have moved so quickly across the sky, from the eastern morning sky to the southern evening sky. It could not have stood over a particular house in any meaningful way, nor, I think, can it be taken seriously as a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. A supernova is a little better because at least it can be visible for over a year and be a spectacular phenomenon to observe, but there are no suitable 2,000-year-old remnants or nebulae. One of the common things you'll find is the combination view. In other words, recognizing that none of the views we've mentioned fit. Quite a few scholars have thought, well, why don't we just combine different views? So they take three completely unrelated astronomical events in 7 to 5 BC, the Jupiter-Saturn in conjunctions in Pisces in 7 BC, then a grouping of planets in 6 BC, and then a comet or a nova in 5 BC. And they kind of imagine that a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. But as a number of unfortunate bungee jumpers have discovered for a brief moment or two, some cords aren't as strong as they're purported to be. But Matthew speaks, you see, of only one star that appeared, it rose, it led the Magi to Bethlehem, and then stood over the house where Jesus was. So since every strand of the cord is badly frayed, it seems to me this cord of 3 strands is strikingly threadbare. Don't jump. Okay, the true Star of Bethlehem. Moving on to a more positive analysis. Really, when I was beginning to get into this topic and was looking at the various candidates from the perspective of looking at Matthew and trying to build on Matthew, it didn't honestly take very long before I realized that the comet is by far the most plausible, in fact, in my opinion, the only plausible view of the Star of Bethlehem. The comet view has a long history, stretching back to the early centuries of the church. You'll see it on some Christmas cards and decorations and artistic portrayals of the Nativity through the centuries. But what is a comet? Comets were regarded and counted stars by the ancient, if they give it the full name, hairy stars. But they also had some other names for them. At their core, comets are really icy dirt balls, or if you want to put it, really, really, really dirty snowballs that whip around the solar system. They go around the sun, but not in round orbits, but rather very, very elongated oval orbits. And when they get close to the sun, or closer to the sun, any exposed ices on them, chemical, when I say ices, it doesn't mean water, it means chemicals that react to the sun, and they begin to explode off of the nucleus, this dirt ball, towards the sun, taking lots of dust with them and gas. And that dust, as it gathers around the dirt ball, both around it and then behind it, it catches the sunlight and can form a head and a tail, which comets are, of course, famous for. And in many cases, those become visible from the Earth. The sun pushes most of the dirt behind the dirt ball, which also catches the sunlight and can be seen as a dramatic tail. Now, they can become incredibly bright objects. They can become brighter than the full moon. They can become long and stretch all the way across the horizon, and they can become absolutely massive, just the coma, the head of the comet. Comets, like Earthlings, are varied in almost every respect. Their glory, their age, their size, their shape, their color, their orbit. Most comets are invisible to the naked eye, but over the course of a century, there will be something like 81 to 99 comets that are observable without binoculars or a telescope. Among those are a handful of extraordinarily great comets. The most famous, of course, is Halley's Comet, which is returned every 75 to 80 years for the last couple of thousand years. But most of the great comets in history have had schedules that do not bring them back for hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years, if at all. And among the ingredients of cometary greatness are making a close pass by the Earth so that we can see it well, or a close pass by the sun so it's really reacting to the sun's presence, having lots of volatile gases and plenty of dust and dirt with which to give rise to long tails and big comas or heads. So how does a comet cast light on the mystery of the Star of Bethlehem? Well, let's just run through a number of points that I think draw this out. First is that issue of the age of the infants killed by Herod. Herod killed infants up to those in their second year based upon when the star had first appeared. Now, a large comet like Hale-Bopp, when I say large, it's about 40 or 60 or slightly more kilometers in diameter. That can remain visible to the naked eye for well over a year. In fact, Hale-Bopp was visible for 18 months. Those kinds of comets are the most extraordinary in brightness and size. Only a supernova is the only other astronomical object that can suddenly appear and remain visible for over a year, and we've already ruled that out. The rising. The Magi's mention of the comet's rising and attributing so much meaning to it makes sense only, it seems to me, if a comet is in view, because no other astronomical body has a surprising or an impressive, visually impressive, or a potentially meaningful rising. In fact, but many of the greatest comets in history give forth their most magnificent displays at risings and settings. Why? Because they're emerging from their closest encounter with the sun at that point. They're at their brightest, they're moving their fastest through the constellations, and they are large and long, oftentimes. And if their orbit brings them close enough to Earth after rounding the sun, or if the sun causes the comet to fragment, the size can be even more remarkable. No ancient could predict the orbit or the behavior of comets. So the 1+ year visibility and the rising together, just those two things alone, are a major clue that we're dealing with a large comet like Hale-Bopp that makes a close pass by the sun, something that really hasn't happened in the scientific period. We have many small comets that make close passes by the sun. We've had many large comets, but they didn't come close to the sun. The rich meaning of the star. The star revealed that the Messiah had been born and that he was worthy of worship. Comets alone were capable of communicating a great deal of information because they moved within the starry sky, seeming to interact with planets and stars, and especially the constellations, and they changed their appearance, their forms and their locations, and the timing of their appearance and phases might well seem loaded with meaning and significance. When we look, moreover, at the comet records of astronomers in Babylon, we find something that I was quite excited to see when I first discovered this. They took note of comets at 5 points in a comet's career. 2 of those 5 points are mentioned in Matthew regarding the star, the first appearing and the rising. That seems to me a remarkable coincidence. Moreover, comets were sometimes taken as wonderfully positive omens. Origen, in fact, cites a work which goes into this in some detail, an ancient work. They can be regarded as marking the birth or the coronation of great leaders. For example, a comet appeared around the time of the birth of Mithridates the Great, king of Pontus, Rome's great and formidable enemy, in the year 135. And another comet, that was the time of his birth, another comet around the time of his coronation in the year 120. And Mithridates made a big deal about this in his propaganda, that these 2 comets set him apart for greatness. A bright comet during the games held in honor of Julius Caesar after his death in 44 BC was universally accepted by the Roman population as a wonderful omen, and by many as an omen that Caesar himself had been accepted among the divines. And by Octavian, his chosen successor, as a great omen for his own personal career. Ancient sources also show us that comets could be regarded as going before someone. For example, the first century BC Greek historian Diodorus Siculus relates how a comet went before and led the Greek general Timoleon as he sailed westwards toward the boot of Italy on his way to Sicily. So even that language that Matthew uses of the star going before the Magi. Ancient sources also describe comets as standing over particular places. Again, the very language that Matthew uses. For example, Josephus tells of how a comet stood over Jerusalem in the period prior to its destruction. Its sword-like appearance heralding its impending doom. Likewise, Cassius Dio tells of a comet in 12 BC that was raised up or was hanging over Rome for several days. That way of speaking, by the way, is the language of appearance, phenomenological language. It was standard in the ancient world. It's used in the Bible. It's still used widely today, even by professional astronomers. And when we talk about this rising of the sun, obviously that is the language of appearance. The pinpointing of a precise location by a comet is beautifully explained by a comet setting with its tail streaming upwards, the other side of the place from where the observers are. As one astronomer has written, only a tailed comet can appear to stand over a place, its long, upward streaking tail seeming to point downwards to one particular location on the earth below. Moreover, only a comet can explain the movement of the star so quickly within a couple of months from the eastern morning sky where it was when it rose to the southern evening sky where it was when the Magi were taking the journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. You see, because a comet is a solar system object moving at its greatest speed through the inner solar system as it's approaching the sun and retreating from the sun, it typically moves rapidly through the stars and the constellations from one region of the sky to another. Moreover, almost everyone agrees that Numbers 24:17 played a role in the enabling of the Magi to interpret the star. After all, there was no oracle in the Old Testament that more closely linked the Messiah's coming with the appearance of a celestial body. Balaam's oracle speaks of the Messiah's coming in terms of a scepter star that rises. To quote, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." Now, what should be noted is that many of the top Hebrew linguists point out that the Hebrew word here for scepter probably refers to a comet. In fact, the Revised English Bible renders the word scepter here comet in Numbers 24:17. And notably, the rabbis called comets scepter stars. Where scepter occurs with star in parallel with star, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that Balaam is employing double entendre here, speaking literally of the scepter star, the Messiah, and metaphorically of the scepter star, the Messiah. Literally of the star, metaphorically of the Messiah. The literal scepter star would announce the birth of the metaphorical scepter star, the Messiah, the one who will wield sovereign and military authority over Israel and its neighbors. This implies that a comet, presumably one that looked like a scepter, because comets can have these dramatic appearances, would attend the Messiah's birth. The Magi and Matthew, in claiming we have seen his star at its rising, are widely regarded as alluding to Balaam's oracle, clearly focusing on the literal aspect. Incidentally, 2nd century Justin Martyr and Irenaeus state that the Magi came to the conclusion about the significance of the star through Numbers 24:17, interpreting it both literally and metaphorically. And Origen in the 3rd century made the same claim. We could say more than this, but the final point I'll make here is the uniqueness of the star suggests that it was a comet. It was very uncommon, obviously, for Magi to undertake a long trip to pay homage to a foreign dignitary. Well, comets are unique. No two comets are identical in chemical constituency, in size, and orbit, and even the same comet never puts on the same show on Earth because Earth is at different from this perspective of Earth, because Earth is at different stages of its orbit when the comet comes through. Now, we can go a little further and say to move from the eastern morning sky to the southern evening sky in the way that the comet does, it suggests that the comet was moving in an orbital direction opposite that of Earth, and hence, we would say, was retrograde. The comet view is the earliest astronomical view in the early church, strongly defended by Origen in the 3rd century. The mid-2nd century Gospel of James that we've mentioned speaks of it in terms that are consistent with it being a comet. And Ignatius in the early 2nd century, quoting a 1st century source, describes the star in terms that make it sound like a very bright, large comet. So what comet was it? Well, some have suggested Halley's Comet, but it wasn't the Star of Bethlehem. It appeared too early, remained visible for only 56 days, and did not have a rising or ever appear in the southern sky. Others have suggested it was a comet mentioned in the surviving 5 BC Chinese record, but that comet likewise was only visible for 70 days and did not have a rising. The star had to be a different comet, much greater than those comets, a comet more like Hale-Bopp. The question we might all ask at that point is, but why isn't there some other mention of this comet? Well, the assumption that I found when I was working on the Star of Bethlehem is that if the Star of Bethlehem was a real astronomical entity, there would be a record of it. Surely there would be a record of it, some astronomical record or something in the Greco-Roman writings. But that, I discovered in my research, is a big fallacy in the historical quest for the star. If truth be told, we have the records of only a paltry bunch of astronomical records from that period, less than 1/3 of the comets. Unfortunately, we have no records of comets from Babylon after 87 BC. Of those that we do have, about half are found in scattered references in Greco-Roman literature and half in remaining surviving Chinese record. In each case, the records of those comets was preserved because the comet was perceived to have some significance to the people who preserved them. The Chinese preserved some comets because they believed that they had some astrological or ideological significance. The Greeks and Romans mentioned comets when they were pertinent to the story that they were trying to tell or the point that they were trying to make. For example, if Josephus hadn't perceived in the year-long comet that stood over Jerusalem, if he hadn't perceived that to be an omen of Jerusalem's destruction, that phenomenal comet would have been lost to history because we have no other record of it. And that was a great comet, by the way, over a year visible. That puts it in the same league as Hale-Bopp and the Star of Bethlehem. And it's the same with the star, as in its memory was preserved by the early Christians because of its perceived messianic significance. So putting all of this together, we have a large, retrograde, long period, that means it takes a long time to go around the sun, comet full of reactive chemicals. It first passes the threshold for naked eye visibility when it's still far from the sun, which is the appearing. And then it makes a close pass by the sun, which explains its rising. And then it makes a close pass by Earth, switching from the morning sky to the evening sky. It appears in the southern sky to go before the Magi in Bethlehem. It climaxes its show that night by standing over one particular location, pinpointing it as the place where the Messiah was. So, just have a few more minutes to try and initiate you to the question of what did the star do? What did the star do? What did this comet do in connection with its rising in the eastern sky that convinced the Magi that the Jewish Messiah had been born and could be found in Judea? This is history, after all. Something awesome evidently occurred to so firmly convince these men that the Messiah was right then a baby in Judea. And as I've mentioned, a comet is uniquely well equipped to explain that, because comets, as they round the sun, are at their most active, their brightest, and they have these famously variety of forms. They can look like fans, horses, manes, serpents, swords, glasses, fountains, rabbits, humans, arrows. And they can move around the constellations. Now, obviously, if there's a serpent-shaped comet in a serpentine constellation, that was perceived, and we're told that, as a bad omen for the ruling dynasty. A sword-shaped comet over a city would mean destruction for that city. So there's a kind of obviousness with comets. It doesn't take a lot of interpretation when you see it. We can safely assume that the star communicated its message to the Magi by its forms and its interaction with the constellations, particularly the so-called zodiacal constellations, that is, the constellations through which the sun and moon pass, since a rising in particular is in view. So are we left to wonder what the Star of Wonder was and what it did in that sense? Well, very briefly, it seems to me that there is a most peculiar description of the nativity of Jesus in the book of Revelation, which many of us will be familiar with. I want you to notice all of the astronomical language in this text in Revelation 12, 1-5. The heaven, the sun, the moon, the constellations, the stars, a meteor storm, that is, stars being thrown from their places. And even the word sign, which significantly can have the meaning constellation. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Here, very mysteriously, the Messiah's birth is portrayed as occurring in the heavens, involving 2 constellations. The constellation of the Virgin, Virgo, who is the only female constellation that hosts the sun, and who has 12 stars visible to the naked eye in her crown. And the surrounding constellation, or the neighboring constellation rather, is Hydra, which is the serpentine dragon. Why does John's great overview of history from Jesus' birth until the end of the age begin with an astronomical version of the nativity story? It seems to me that there's an obvious explanation of that very peculiar fact, that John is describing the phenomenon that the Magi witnessed and that persuaded them that the Messiah had been born and that they should go on a pilgrimage to Judea to find and worship him. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that even as the Virgin gave birth to a special baby on earth, God was broadcasting on the celestial IMAX screen of the sky what was happening. And at the point when the Virgin Mary was given birth to the Messiah on earth, the constellation figure Virgo, the Virgin, was giving birth to a comet, playing the part of the baby Messiah in heaven. That is, the heavens were declaring his birth even as it happened on earth, but in such a way that only those viewing them through the correct interpretive paradigm could discern its meaning. But does Revelation 12, just a few more minutes here, does Revelation 12 fit Matthew 2 astronomically? The fact is that the sun is first described as clothing the woman, or the virgin, while the moon is under her feet. That indicates that the unfolding birth scene is occurring while the constellation figure is rising in the eastern sky, emerging from its annual encounter with the sun. That, of course, is in remarkable accord with what Matthew said about the star at its rising. Such is the detail of the description in verse 1 of Revelation 12, we can actually identify the very day and year in view. September the 15th, 6 BC. It's the only point in the year 7 to 1 BC when the moon could probably properly be said to be under the virgin's or the woman's feet while the sun was clothing her. Okay, let's consider it further. If indeed Revelation 12 is describing the great celestial wonder that announced Jesus' birth, then how did it happen astronomically? How could the virgin appear to be pregnant with a growing baby and then deliver a baby? Well, there is only one way that the drama can be pulled off, and that is by a very large comet, a Hale-Bopp type comet. You see, the heads of large comets like Hale-Bopp are elliptical or oval. In the context of a womb, such a form would naturally be regarded as a fetus. Of course, as we've already seen, Matthew 2 requires that the Star of Bethlehem was a large comet. And that is an astonishing similarity, because relatively few historical comets are large. And in recent centuries, no large comet has come particularly close to the sun. But in the case of the Star of Bethlehem, it seems to me that is what we have. And for the baby to become larger and larger in the womb and then be born, the comet would have to be on a retrograde orbital path. Remember that Matthew's portrayal also suggests something similar, that brings it close to the Earth after a close pass by the sun. In order to stay in the very same narrow zone of Virgo in her womb, the movement of the comet on its orbit has to be such. You've got to remember, Earth is moving on its orbit. So the two have to be moving in consort to enable this to occur. The virgin's pain in labor is presumably because the baby looks relatively large as it's weighing down on her pelvic floor just prior to birth. The baby's birth is naturally the moment when it first fully emerges from the virgin's womb. And we can see that the profiles of the Star of Bethlehem comet based on Matthew 2 and of Revelation 12, the actual comet that was required in both is identical. A very large, intrinsically bright, retrograde comet that came close to the sun and had a remarkable rising in the eastern sky. And both are related to the birth of the Messiah. And if you know anything about comets, you'll appreciate how utterly astonishing this match is, because such comets are extremely uncommon. But we can go further. Based solely on the data from Revelation 12, which is so specific because Earth has to be moving in its orbit at the same time as the comet on its, it allows us to actually produce an orbit for this comet. That allows us to confirm definitively whether indeed Revelation 12 can be an independent record of the Star of Bethlehem. And it actually would enable us to recreate the whole story of the star. When it first appeared, through which constellations it traveled, how bright it became, how close to the sun and earth it came, what it looked like, how it ushered the magi to Bethlehem, and then pinpointed the very house where Jesus was. Well, it took me many months of research, but eventually in collaboration with some of the world's top comet astronomers, I did light upon an orbit for the comet that played the part of the baby in this celestial drama. Accordingly, you can now see for yourself what the magi would have seen when at the time of the rising. So as I draw this together, the big question is, would this comet from Revelation 12, about a month or so after the baby's birth, have been in the southern sky to usher the magi from Jerusalem to Bethlehem? The answer is yes, indeed, it would. They would have seen it steadily moving in front of them towards the south-southeast where they were heading. And would such a comet then have gone on to set in the west where they were, so it could stand over the house, pinpointing it as the place where the Messiah was? Yes, it would. From the perspective of where the Magi were standing, the comet was standing immediately over one particular house. Now, we can talk a little bit more in light of questions. I just want to, if you want to explore a little bit about what exactly happened over the course of an orbit, we can. But I'm going to skip forward to, very briefly, to the question, how does a star compare to other comets? So we're going to have to skip through some slides at that point. How does a star compare to other comets? I confess I gave no thought to that when I was doing my research. And I was visiting with a comet astronomer, one of the top comet astronomers, David Asher, and he was eager. The one thing he wanted to know as an astronomer was how close did the comet come to Earth? He was taken aback, actually, by how close it came, particularly because it's a large comet and it was coming in the opposite direction to planet Earth. And that troubled him because that's an astronomer's ultimate nightmare. And it got me thinking, how did the Bethlehem star compare to other great comets of history? And what's really amazing is it comes across as the most intrinsically bright comet in history. In its period of visibility, it's in the super league of the greatest comets. In terms of its size, it was one of the biggest. In terms of its brightness, it was among the elite. The great comets of 1577, 1680, 1865, 1882, and 1965, those are the most bright comets in recent history. Many comets have come closer to the sun, and many others have come closer to the earth, but no comet has come as close to both the sun and the earth. That combination alone marked it as a truly magnificent comet. In conclusion, it emerges that the star was the greatest comet in human history, according to my research. And that seemed to me precisely what we'd expect of the star, the greatest comet in history. Why does it matter? God is an enthusiast for astronomy. Why does it matter? Many have poked fun at the account of the star, but not only does it come across as believable, but it comes across as incredibly authentic, because nobody could have invented such a phenomenon. So it confirms Matthew's reliability as a historian and a biographer. Why does it matter? Because God is the creator and the sustainer of the universe, who stakes his claim to ownership and expects humans to honor him as such. It is God's fingerprint, the Star of Bethlehem, it seems to me, his fingerprint on his creation, speaking powerfully to us in the 21st century. And it demonstrates that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the prophesied Son of God, the Son of David, the Messiah, whose death atones for the sins of all who look to him. There is a lot at stake in the discussion of the star. I hope that you can see that now. And my encouragement to all of us is, will we follow the Magi in bowing the knee before Jesus? I'm just going to close with a word of prayer, and then we'll go to Q&A. Lord Jesus, we just want to acknowledge you. We want to acknowledge you as the great Messiah, that you came, that you were announced in the heavens, and that all those who had eyes to see could detect what a marvelous and wonderful thing was occurring on earth. Give us a thrill at you and at what you did to honor Jesus. In Jesus' name, amen.